few more people might trickle in, but first of all, thank you very much for coming. It's great to see a crowd come out for Foucault. So on a Sunday morning, no less. So the goal of this presentation is to really just give a nice, easy, no jargon, straightforward introduction to Foucault. He's one of the most cited authors in the social sciences and humanities. You may have come across him in courses before, but he's a notoriously difficult writer, as with a lot of French philosophy this period. But he can have some other sort of odd tricks. So we're going to try to go through some of his methodologies, some of just sort of his general strategies, and give you a sense of what his methods were, and give you, perhaps make it easier to go read Foucault for yourself. We're not going to do a comprehensive survey of absolutely everything that he said. That would take much longer than an hour, but hopefully this will make you interested in something and encourage you to go out yourself. So one of the things that can be particularly difficult about Foucault is that there's no overall philosophy, and that can come as a surprise. He did not consider himself to be a general theoretician or have a general philosophy of how the world works. Rather, he considered himself to be a historian of problems, or sometimes he'd refer to it as a historian of thought. Now, let's avoid some confusion right off the bat. By problem, I don't mean something bad, nor does he. A problem for Foucault is just something more like a homework problem. It's something that is confusing, something that requires some kind of thought to figure out. And his idea was that in society, throughout history, we've been faced with a multitude of different problems at different times and in different contexts. And each time we face a problem, we have some sort of new solution to that problem. And so what he's trying to do in his histories is go through how did people resolve a particular problem as it arose, and how do people create new problems that they then try to solve. So this can make reading him a bit odd, because you'll be expecting some kind of philosophy of power or something like that, and you'll find yourself reading extended tracts on Greek meditation practices or grain prices in 18th century France. There is a reason why he's doing that, and it's trying to go through the particularities of these problems in order to pay attention to the thought that it takes to resolve them. So what we're going to do, though, is to talk about some of the general strategies that he used. So even though he is dealing with all sorts of particularities, he does have a general plan for it. And that plan takes this form. So he pretty much always had this hypothesis in the background that any resolution to a problem is going to involve some combination of these three things: knowledge, power, and subjectivity. He'll call them different things at different times, but that's just what we're going to call them for this presentation. So by knowledge, the question is, what is known in this situation? How is science formed? How do people come to understand something in a particularly new situation? By power, it's the question of relationships, interactions. How do people influence each other? What kinds of institutions or structures are at stake in a particular problem? And by the subject, it's a question of who. Who's at stake in this system? What kinds of people are being produced? What kinds of possibilities do individuals have? It's an ethical question for him. And his idea is that these three questions are actually deeply interrelated. And what we're going to do for the rest of the presentation is go through each one of these in a series, go into more depth of what he was arguing about each of these three things, and go through some of the particular problems in the works that he did to give you a sense of how this plays out. So roughly chronologically, he was interested in knowledge first, and then power in the middle of his career and subjectivity at the end. Although you can tell that he had an interest in all three throughout his career. So I don't mean by this chronological presentation to try to say he's only interested in knowledge at first, then he switches topics, but they're highlighted in particular ways. So let's start with knowledge. As I said before, this is the question of what can be known, how is science formed, etc. And to put it in the most straightforward terms for him, knowledge is something that people do. It's a practice, it's an activity. In the words of his mentor, Gaston Bachelard, facts are made, or for the nice pun in French, les faits sont faits. And that's not to say that facts are totally made up, that it's all fictional, fabricated. The idea is, though, that there's a story behind everything that is known. So you can either tell a story of how an experiment was done in a scientific lab, who did it, when did it happen, under what conditions, or it can get to be much more dramatic, Galileo's trial with the church about astronomy. Or you can even take it to like a religious level. So, there's no better grand story of truth than going up a mountain to get a message from God, carve it into stone, bring it back down to the people. The idea is that no point of knowledge is just sort of appears in someone's mind. It always has to be formed through some particular kind of practice. So in the works that are most famous from this period, he's trying to trace through how this occurs in particular institutions. And he calls these sorts of shared sets of rules in these contexts, originally calls them epistemes, although that's a sort of jargon term. Eventually he simplifies it and starts calling it just games of truth. Just this idea that a shared set of rules that define a field of knowledge in a particular context. So in the History of Madness, for example, which is his first book, it's also his doctoral dissertation, he's interested in how mental asylums in the 18th century, 16th to 18th century, how they started to form their sciences of what we would now start to call modern psychiatry. And that's not just an abstract interest for Foucault. He actually had worked in a psychiatric hospital for a while. He was deeply concerned with the ways in which institutionalization occurred. He became quite involved with the anti-institutional deinstitutionalization movement, the anti-psychiatry movement. A number of other people just worried about the way in which the mentally insane were treated by society. He also was a gay man who had been sent to an institution when he was younger. So this is a very personal topic for him. And that's a theme that will go through all of his topics. Even though they might seem abstract, there's usually some sort of personal connection for Foucault. So the game of truth, or the episteme for psychiatry here, is about forming what counts as a rational human being and delimiting a rational person versus the irrational, and the irrational then being pushed to the margins of society and institutionalized. So this is a question of what kinds of truth are occurring and how that truth comes to matter in these particular circumstances. When the stakes are people being institutionalized, the stakes for being deemed insane are quite high. In the second book, he extends his focus on what it means to be a human being. So we got this idea in the History of Madness of once people are deemed irrational, that's the question. The Order of Things is probably one of his more abstract books, but it was actually his first bestseller. So it's the book that kind of made him a celebrity in France. And it's a much more general question of how did our conception of the modern human being come to arise? And he makes a really radical claim. He claims that the human being did not exist before the 18th century. Now that sounds really strange because presumably there were human beings in ancient China, Greece, etc. He's going to argue though that that is fundamentally different than the kind of human being that arose in the 18th century. And in order to understand that, we're going to have to start to understand his method for this period, which is archaeology. That's not archaeology in the digging sense. It's totally just Foucault's term, whatever reason he did to pick that. So the argument of archaeology, and in the order of things, is that our concepts are not just the material entities that exist out in the world in some sense. They're actually composed through the construction of other elements, forms of science that come to integrate and form a particular entity. So let's take this example of the human being to demonstrate exactly what we mean. So he argues that in the 18th century, the human being was considered to be three things. It was living, it was a laboring entity, and it had language. Each one of those points was going through an intense transformation in the 18th century. So life did not exist as a general category before this point. Biology was about studying living beings out there in the world, but they were not considered living in some abstract sense. Human beings were not part of biology. If you read Linnaeus's great classification of the animal kingdom, human beings do not show up in it. It's not until the 18th century that people start to think of human beings as a particularly living entity. And it's a change in a particular game of truth that brings about this change. Biology goes through a massive revolution in this time, and it starts to incorporate the human being in new, radically new ways because of changes to what counts as true within this field. The same can be said of labor. So this idea of human beings as a laboring entity. This idea that humans are finite beings that must work to provide food, shelter. It extends on this idea of humans as a biological being. This is not a question that had really been posed before, and it brings about a new science. This is the emergence of economics in a particular way. It changes many times, an older form of economics. But it's really about considering the human being as a finite being that has to work to live in the world, not necessarily work in a career sense, but work on the land or something like that. And then finally, he starts to consider the human being, well, the 18th century starts to consider the human being as a linguistic being. And this is about the ramifications of colonialism and more exposure to other languages, other cultures, a real conceptualization of human difference that starts to occur around this period. And with it, the emergence of modern linguistics. So the idea of archaeology is not that any one of these things is brand new at this time, but that they've never been articulated together. And the fact that they get articulated together at this point brings with it some radical new entities, the human being. So when we talk about constructionism like this, and I know that's sort of a dreaded term, social construction, the argument isn't really about, if a tree falls in a forest, is there any, no one there to hear it? It's not about the existence of an external world or anything like that. It's about a recognition that our concepts are more than just the material entities. They're about the concepts. And if the concepts aren't articulated together or they go through radical shifts, we are talking about a new being. There is some kind of radical discontinuity between whatever existed before the 18th century and the human being as we know it now. And arguably, he closes out the order of things by saying, perhaps it will change again. So this is probably Foucault at his most sort of philosophical. He writes a few books here that are the least attached to any particular problem. But as I said, they are still related to a particular question for him. So the knowledge period, it's fairly abstract and probably his hardest writing, most reminiscent of other French philosophers. But after his involvement with the deinstitutionalization movement, he shifts his focus. He'd already been talking about institutions, but he gets involved with something called the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, which was a group in France, the Prison Information Group, which was a group in France who was trying to participate in an ongoing prison reform conversation. And they were doing this by interviewing or just getting letters from inmates in prisons and trying to document what was actually going on inside prison walls in order to make for a more democratic and better conversation about prison reform. And this brings Foucault to the next big theme of his work, which is power. And this is probably what Foucault is most famous for, but also probably most misunderstood. He does not have a general philosophy of power, despite what you may have heard. It is something that is going to be occurring in more piecemeal around particular problems. But if we were to put it in its simplest terms for him, he states this in an interview later in his life. Power for Foucault is when actions influence actions. And that's pretty much all you need to remember for power for Foucault. It's simple, but the ramifications are really broad. So anytime an action encourages other actions, denies other actions, makes something easier, makes something harder, that is an exercise of power for Foucault. So it is not a substance. Power is not something that people have. It's rather something that people do. And they do it all the time. Anytime you're in a relationship with someone, however defined, and you are encouraging them to do something, making it harder for them to do something, that is an exercise of power. So friendship becomes a big site of power. I give someone advice that encourages them to do something, that is an exercise of power. It's not just something like a king issuing proclamations. That might also be an exercise of power, a very strong exercise of power, but that's not the sole kind of power that Foucault is interested in. In fact, if you think of a king sitting in a throne room with the doors locked, maybe they have the authority, but they're never actually doing anything. They're just minding their own business. In Foucault's sense, they're not really exercising power at all, which is a big flip from other ways of conceptualizing power as something that's granted to people. So power is in every single relationship. That means it's extremely dispersed around society. It makes its way into families, friendships. Schools are a huge site of power, the way in which teachers might influence students. Doctors are going to be a huge point of power relationships when they tell someone to eat a particular way or to avoid a certain kind of exercise, something like that. So it's really going to be widespread and something called micropower. It's going to be so minute that you might not even notice that's going on. But Foucault wants to pay attention to the way in which power is dispersed in this way. So let's get to two of the projects that he's working on here. The first book, Discipline and Punish, is the product of his work with the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons. It's a history of prisons, and it brings up the archaeological questions of how did we get to our modern kind of prison, roughly through the 19th century in response to industrialization. He argues that industrialization brought with it a new set of problems, a new set of questions. How do we get, with the increased demand for labor, how do we get people to be more productive? And the solution that was found in society was, well, we pay very close attention to people. We correct them when they do something that's even slightly wrong. We make sure that their posture is great. We make sure that they're eating well. It's this minute kind of power that his approach to power really makes evident. And so he argues that when there was a shift in the prison system, and it went from the king just chopping off people's heads or executing people in the public square to this more quiet, removed, subtle kind of punishment in prisons, set away from society, set away from public eyes, that it might be tempting to think of this as a humanitarian change, that we stopped being so brutal to people. But it actually might just be a shift from one kind of power to another. And perhaps it's actually a more insidious kind of power. It's one that really wants to reshape people on every level. You might object to that, but it's a question worth considering. It's not just a book about prisons, though. So given that this was a general societal problem about labor, and given that these solutions came from not just prisons, although they're particularly apparent in prisons, but you actually find them in a wide spread of institutions. So schools start to operate in this way. Again, this sort of observation, identification, and correction. Weirdly enough, he actually finds examples in gardening books in Discipline and Punish about how if you're trying to get gardens to make the maximum amount of crops, you tie trees to make sure that they grow straight. It's the exact same kind of observation and disciplining of plants that occurs. So we get this idea that a general problem emerges and it has ramifications outside the initial institution or even the most obvious institution. And he calls this dispersed set of power relationships an apparatus, something that gets cemented in some way, a whole network of different ways in which power is exercised on individuals or societies as a whole. So apparatus, or dispositif in French, comes up as a few times, different sorts of general strategies of power. So the second book here, which is the first volume of the History of Sexuality, goes in a slightly different direction. Whereas this one was concerned with a big public conversation about prisons, the History of Sexuality was really in response to the sexual liberation movement in the 1970s. Foucault was extremely interested in that movement. He had a little bit of a tough time with it, though. Given what he'd been arguing in Discipline and Punish about observation and identification having such a strong role in power relationships, he was really nervous about the talk in sexual liberation about authenticity, about having to show your real self, confess, your deepest desires, and that will set you free. He was really nervous that that was actually just another one of these observation methods that might actually end up trapping people in a more subtle way. So he wrote this first volume of the History of Sexuality to address the way in which sexuality came to be seen as the core of people, that it seemed that you had to confess your sexuality in order to be free or liberated in some sense. He ended up actually writing 2 more volumes of History of Sexuality, which we'll talk about later, that take a different turn. And he had another 2 volumes planned before he died. That only one of them was written and it's not been published yet. So in the History of Sexuality, he's interested in the Victorian era and how it is that we came to start talking about sexuality in this particular way. And he argues that sexuality also got problematized as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The question became, how do we produce more workers? How do we increase the population, make a healthy population, make a population that's amenable to labor in particular ways? But this is a slightly different question than what came up in Discipline and Punish. So in prisons, it's about individual bodies being morphed and shaped in particular ways and corrected. In the History of Sexuality, it's about populations, big groups of people, trying to make the population as a whole healthy or grow or be more industrious in some way. So he called this apparatus biopolitics, which is distinguished from discipline because of the way in which it's a group noun. But it's also called biopolitics because it's, he argues, the first time that life itself enters into the political sphere in an explicit way. Biological processes about birth rate and death rate are now the key sites for political intervention in Victorian states, at least in France and England. So these are very different kinds of questions than what was coming up in the archaeology period. There's a much greater concern for power, and because of that, he developed a new method for this. And he called this method genealogy. So this builds on archaeology in particular ways. Remember, with archaeology, we figured out what kinds of concepts were coming together to form our current concepts. Here, Foucault was working in a similar way. So let's say you go through the historical archive and you find a series of things that are getting connected in a particular way. So in the Victorian era, you find an increased focus on the traditional family, mother, father, producing children. This gets valorized in particular ways. Sexual health becomes a really big theme, that there's a proper way to be a sexual being and an improper way to be a sexual being in very controlled ways, usually around healthy being productive. And there's also a new growth in demography, in population statistics, birth rates, death rates. This had not really been a question prior to this point. And the question for Foucault at this point is, if you're faced with these elements, if you see these in the historical record, what unites them? They might look quite disparate. And he argues that they're connected by a shared problem. This is the problematization of sexuality, society trying to ask, okay, how do we manage sexuality as a response to industrialization? And these three partial solutions came up. They started to regulate for normality, regulate for traditional families, etc. But there were other ways in which that problem could have been handled that we ended up not following. For example, this is around the period as well that homosexuality becomes really challenged. Homosexuality would not be productive. It would not produce children. And this is the point where that becomes seen as an unhealthy exercise of sexuality. Masturbation or sex for pleasure also becomes something that's really bad at this point. If it's wasting its energy and not producing children, it's not a good use of time or your energy. And so you can see how biopolitics or an apparatus starts to select for or push people toward particular solutions over others. It's not necessarily that any one person had in mind, like, aha, I'm going to start talking about demography and plan that out as a grand strategy. No one person probably had that idea. It was rather something that was sort of casually or even just implicitly molded over time by accidents. And what genealogy starts to show us is that things could have been different. Had the exercise of power been different, we could have dealt with sexuality in very different ways. So genealogy shows contingency. It shows, as well as archaeology shows contingency as well. But it shows that things did not have to be the way that they are now. It's also worth pointing out that genealogy is not about trying to find origins of something. It's rather about just asking, how did people respond to particular problems? And how could they have responded differently? It's not about trying to find when was the first time someone talked about sexuality in a book, but how did they respond to a particular formulation of it at a particular time in response to particular questions. So given the contingency of all this, things like discipline and biopolitics are not meant to be universal concepts. They're not meant to be something that, once Foucault has described it, they existed in all societies at all times. You can go find it whatever corner of the world. They're things that emerge in particular places at particular times. And so you have to ask yourself, if something seems like discipline or biopolitics, how might have that been an influence? What processes brought biopolitics or discipline into various new corners of the world? Or might there be something else that's emerging, that's similar but not quite different? He really wants to pay attention to the singularity, the specialness of particular phenomena. So he was actually pretty convinced by the end of his life that biopolitics was fading. It had been a huge point throughout the Enlightenment, but he thought it still existed in particular ways, but that it might be giving way to some other forms of power. in particular, neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is something that he started studying in a series of lectures in the late 70s, mid to late 70s. And the idea of neoliberalism is that economic rules are really seen as the key political format. Rather than thinking about populations as a biological entity, it's really about thinking of economic laws as if they were political laws. So it emerges out of Germany and the United States explicitly as an economic program, but Foucault argues that because of its pretensions at politics, it has broad social and political consequences that extend beyond the mere economic free trade agreements or anything like that. It's not the case, though, that he's trying to say that neoliberalism is something good or something bad. He's just arguing that this is something that we are now currently facing, that this might be a new apparatus that was emerging, and he probably was correct. For Foucault, critique was always just a question not of evaluating something as good or bad. That would be too broad of a judgment for him. Rather, the point of critique for him is to explore the limits of a concept. So any particular regime of power, discipline, biopolitics, neoliberalism, gives people certain capabilities and removes certain capabilities. The question is, what kind of life is possible within any one of these apparatuses? It might make certain things possible. Neoliberalism makes economic and certain other kinds of relationships very easy. It allows for a certain kind of removal from the state, which perhaps would be, given his studies on discipline in prisons, might actually be a beneficial thing. That said, it also has its clear limits in the way in which it undermines people's ability to act outside of economic rationality. It really confines people to a particular kind of economic rational actor that we might find quite depressing. But for Foucault, it's all just about trying to find how far can these concepts go, what kinds of possibilities are made for action within it. And that brings us to the last topic of the triangle here. So he's already been considering the way in which knowledge is formed, the way in which power is interacting, but you might see a theme of, okay, so what can we do within these structures? And that's what he's trying to get at with this last topic of subjectivity. The question here is, sort of, who is this all about? What kind of person is being produced in these particular settings? What kinds of capabilities might they have for exercising freedom, self-determination, or caring about others within the confines given by the institutions discussed previously? So this comes about in a particularly sort of odd period for Foucault. He, after the publication of the last two books, went into a bit of a depression. He didn't publish another book for 8 years. And he ends up traveling around trying to find ways out of the kind of paranoia that biopolitics and discipline set up. There's sort of this idea when you read those books that everything, like you're always being watched, nothing you do is free, and it feels quite stifling on some level. And Foucault understood that, and people critiqued him for saying, okay, so there's no possibility for freedom. And that made him deeply uncomfortable. So he ends up going to Japan for a while to study Zen Buddhist meditation. He ends up going to Iran to be a journalist and cover the Iranian Revolution. He read some really, really interesting things about the Iranian Revolution, gets the revolution totally wrong, made some predictions that were just totally false, but they're still kind of interesting things to read. And he ends up moving to Berkeley, California, and makes a transition in his career that no one expected, which is that he starts writing about Greek and Roman practices. He starts writing about Greek and Roman dietary restrictions, meditation practices. Generally speaking, he started writing about these things called practices of the self. And what he found for the Greeks and Romans was a particularly explicit and strong focus on these things. So a practice of the self is a particular way in which a person forms themselves. This can be through things like meditation, as I've said, diet, exercise, self-reflection. It also comes up in relationships with others. So friendship can be a really important practice of the self. The way in the people who you choose to spend time with, if you're a good judge of good advice or you can't tell if there's good advice, these are really important ways in which you can modify yourself, make yourself into something different than you were. And he argues that the Greeks were particularly interested in this, and so he finds in their writing a very explicit formulation of it. And this is an extension of the history of sexuality. So he's interested, again, in how sexuality came to be seen as the core of people, but what kinds of potentials there might be for other kinds of sexuality, other forms of pleasure that we might find as a sort of practice of the self. And so he goes to these older sources. So practice of the self, ways of caring for yourself, just as a general point of concern that the Greeks were fascinated by. Socrates keeps repeating this point of know thyself, that it's important to be self-reflective, understand who you are, what kinds of capacities you have, and this is carried forward into the Romans. And he argues that we maybe don't talk about this as explicitly anymore, but he really wants to stress the capacities of people to self-invent, even in the face of oppressive regimes. So just to underline something, because even though we're talking about the self, this is not self-centered. Friendship is an extremely important point. Family is an incredibly important place where people form relationships with the others that are self-transformation. Chosen family as well. He pays a lot of attention to teaching relationships. Again, judges of good character. Do you find a good teacher? Do you listen to someone? Are you more receptive to good advice? Can you judge good advice from bad advice? So caring about yourself doesn't mean that you just sort of lock yourself in a room and focus just on yourself. It actually means making sure that you're fulfilling your obligations towards others as well, being a good citizen, being a good friend, being a good family member. These are really important ways in which people care for themselves in quite vital ways. So the question for subjectivity is an ethical one. It's all about making decisions about what you are going to do, given the opportunities that you have. It's also deeply related to this question of knowledge. How do you know yourself? What kinds of sciences might you use? Did you refer to biology, psychology? Today we might all go read a psychology book to understand how you're supposed to take care of yourself. So it's a really sort of the culmination of the questions that he's been asking. And he focuses on this in the last 2 volumes of the History of Sexuality, and then he tragically passed away quite young. He was the first French public figure to die from AIDS. So unfortunately, we don't get as well fleshed out some writings on this stuff. His writings at the end become intensely personal, given his declining health. This might all seem like the most abstract and removed, given that he's writing about the oldest topics, but it is deeply personal writing for Foucault. So if there's one big takeaway I see from Foucault's work, it's in this question. What difference does today make compared to yesterday? What kinds of possibilities for action and thinking do we have in face of today? And in order to answer that, we have to pay very close attention to the present. I mean, we can't just resort to using the old ways of thinking, the old ways of acting that might have been solutions to older problems. The question is to be really focused on what kinds of problems are we facing today, and what kinds of capabilities do we have to face them. And that, I find, runs throughout Foucault's work. It's not meant to be a suspicion of the past, but rather a question of how might the past have receded in its importance and what kinds of capabilities we might have for the future. So I actually would like to try an experiment with that. Well, first, let's just open it up to questions. And then we're going to try this workshop thing. So I would like to try brainstorming with people. What kinds of problems might we be facing today? And problems in the Foucault sense. What kinds of general challenges, things that are confusing in today's society that might require some rethinking? And then the question would be, how might Foucault's approach help to clarify or resolve those problems or confusions? Obviously, we can't do that in full. That would require historical research and all sorts of stuff. But the idea would be to formulate some of the questions that might help to better address those problems. So that's what we're going to do in a bit, but I just want to open it up for clarification questions before we get into that. Any questions? Yeah.
I have a question. When you're reviewing the history of sexuality, the first volume there, you talked about how sort of the movement towards discipline, which we saw in, I guess, the discipline moves towards more biological area in terms of disciplining the body. You talked about the need for productivity, becoming more and more intimate, and sort of involving regulation of sexuality. But isn't that the argument that's presented by Marcuse and Reich, that this book begins and ends as an attack
So it begins and ends with.
You presented the argument, which is the repressive hypothesis, but he starts and ends the book by saying that he is disagreeing with the repressive hypothesis and sees it as pernicious.
So let's go through exactly what the repressive hypothesis is. So there's this sort of pop culture version of Victorian era that no one wanted to talk about sexuality, that it was all closeted, it was all shameful, no one wanted to talk about it. And that's what he calls the repressive hypothesis. By and large, it's this idea that it should be shameful and not talked about. But he argues when he's going through the historical record that you find actually an intense fascination with sexuality, even if it's not named as such. So the idea that the repressive hypothesis idea that no one was thinking about sexuality ends up being false. It ends up that they were thinking about it a whole lot, but maybe not talking about it in public. So biopower is a concern with sexuality. It's fascinated by sexuality, but it might think of sexuality as something that needs to be done outside of something like the public sphere, done in people. It's the exercise of power in people's bedrooms, even if it's not in explicit public statements. That said, you do find, he argues, in political proclamations, dictates, etc., sexuality is a big topic of conversation. So this idea that the Victorian era never talked about sexuality, that is false.
I have to say, I'm not totally satisfied with your argument, but I'm not totally satisfied with Foucault's argument. I don't really understand, because he seems to be, on the one hand, reaffirming the arguments made by Wilhelm Reich and Marcuse, and at the same time attacking them. I don't really understand exactly what he's doing with that.
Gone through the summary. Other questions? Yeah, morality is a huge topic for Foucault in his later work. So morality is an exercise of power, very straightforward. It's the kinds of lessons you get from family institutions, religious institutions. It does exercise power, but that's not to say that it's necessarily oppressive. So power for Foucault, given that it's so dispersed, doesn't mean that it's always going to be an absolute thing. Actually, it never is going to be an absolute thing. There are always going to be possibilities for action within it. So Foucault actually contrasts ethics with morality. Morality as this sort of set of rules, ethics as how do people actually enact the kinds of impositions that are put on them. So morality is something that's perhaps suspect, but he is not trying to disregard morality altogether. Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit on critique on the sexual liberation movement?
Mm-hmm. So the sexual liberation movement, he was a big fan of in terms of just its political objectives. He was suspicious of this idea that freedom or liberation would come from bearing your soul or something like that, or expressing the deepest, darkest secret of your life, which was presented as being sexuality. He was much more interested in the way in which people could explore their sexualities, find different ways of enjoying themselves and relationships with others, different forms of pleasure, rather than trying to present sexuality as something that would control everything in their life. Much more of a sort of playful relationship with sexuality than a deathly serious one, which is obviously not how everyone in the sexual liberation movement thought of sexuality, but it was more what he was nervous about. Any other clarification? Oh.
You mentioned like the fact that there was no absolute power,
Mm-hmm.
but then there's this part where he talks about benefits panopticon,
Mm-hmm.
and it does appear that conceptually it is the full power, because if it's the ideal like concept of the state, it could control effectively the whole society without even moving the finger.
So the panopticon, just to go through this. This is an example that he uses in Discipline and Punish. The idea of a panopticon, it's a prison design where there's a central tower and where there's one guard, or possibly more, but only need one guard, and all the inmates are in prison cells in a circle around that central tower. So the idea is that one person could watch an entire group, although they're obviously not literally watching everyone at the same time, but anyone could be watched at any one time. So it's this idea of observation going over an entire society, a quite broad domain. And people have made the connection with things like video cameras, surveillance tapes, etc. What I mean by saying that it's not absolute power is that even if you're being observed, you can still do other things. There's always going to be an option for resistance. It's not like you're chained to a wall, cannot move. In fact, Foucault would say that that's almost, if there's no choice of the matter, then there's no exercise of power. If people aren't actually acting, then there's no action on action, so it's not actually really worth talking about. So that's not, just to say that power isn't absolute does not mean to say that power is not pervasive and that it's not really forceful. But there's always going to be the option for reversal to some extent. Obviously, that's what separates something like a friendship and its relationships of power from something like a prison. In a prison, the relationships of power can be literally set in stone, in the physical relationship of the guard versus the inmate. In a friendship, you can reverse those relationships of power. I give advice to one person, they give advice to me. We can play around with it and take turns, essentially. That doesn't really happen in prisons. But there's still, to some degree of freedom. So I'm going to try out this experiment. I've never tried this before. It's a bit quick, but I'm a big believer in learning by doing. So I just want to take this as a chance to brainstorm something. So what would be a question today that people feel is not being adequately addressed? What is something that seems to be perplexing society and we haven't really figured out how to think about it yet?
I'm going to cheat a little bit because it's actually a question. So you spoke at the end of this concern of on the care for self.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But the care for self is something that comes up in the books we know more, like history of sexuality, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So it comes up from the beginning, from the onset. And one thing that strikes me in Foucault is maybe it's between the lines, maybe it's more explicit, I'm not sure,
Mm-hmm.
but that's an impression I have of how useful he can be, is the idea that the care for self is a form of power.
Mm-hmm.
And that power is also applied, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So my question is, how is the concern for care for self at the end of his life different from what he had before? And also, how do we address precisely that, the idea that power is something that we...
would you really argue that care for the self is something that people are thinking about? In the Foucauldian sense? Because, so let me just clarify
So
something.
I'm saying Foucault has thought
Yeah.
care for self from the onset, right? And so,
The reason I asked the question about a contemporary problem is that, and I try to make clear by the way in which Foucault is addressing particular political questions in his society, is that for Foucault, a problem is not something that the philosopher invents. It's not something that comes from reading an 18th century philosopher and that you then come up with the question from there. It's something that actually gets generated in practice and through people's lives. And it comes from just paying attention to the conversations going on around you. So I wouldn't really imagine that Foucault himself would become a problem. To address a bit more the content of your question, yeah, care of the self is something that comes up from the beginning. When he starts to talk about the way in which medical relationships and institutions occur, there is a self-formation that is going on there. He is more interested in the kind of self-directed care of the self by the end of his life, rather than the imposed kind of the doctor or the clinician or...
but doesn't that join the neoliberal paradigm?
Possibly, yeah. But let's try to take this idea of a question that's been coming up in society. Yeah.
I guess it ties to his later reflections on the history of sexuality, but just I guess the binary conception of gender that's kind of put and redefined.
Yeah.
I guess would be.
I think that's a great example. So there's definitely today a re-questioning of gender, and that is happening in very public ways. It has become a point of big legal dispute, at least in the United States. I'm American, sorry. And it's interesting to see with gender, like the example of gender really highlights the way in which a particular problematization can start to lead to really contradictory responses. So the fact that bathroom laws are being passed in certain states is a brand new kind of response to a new question that is being posed. And you can see that as the flip side of an increased awareness and queer activism. Was that a hand? Nope. Okay. So then the question would be, okay, so gender is a problem today. And again, problem doesn't mean bad, it just means something to think through. What are the kinds of terms, to think of the archaeology, what kinds of concepts are going into forming the current debate or discussion around gender? Yeah. Right, but that's what we're trying to figure out. So what gender in itself means. What kinds of terms do people refer to when trying to understand gender? In the hat. There's definitely a place where biology is coming up, and biological determination is definitely a thing that people are questioning. So that could be a really interesting place to look. Is there a change going on today in the way in which biology is thought of relating to human beings? Perhaps we are getting to a point where we're no longer thinking of biological determinism as quite this ironclad system that it might have used to be. There's an increased awareness of ways in which human behavior, human identity extends beyond biology. So that could be a really interesting place to go try to resolve this question. Social differentiation as well. The way in which groups are informing identity, if there's possibly a change that's occurring there. Other kinds of concepts that might be coming up in this debate? Mm-hmm.
Migrants and how the movements of the populations are coming to Europe.
Mm-hmm. New migration patterns, new histories are coming into contact with each other, and that could definitely bring about new kinds of rethinking or challenges to old ways of thinking in a particular way. So this gets a sense of some of the ways in which you could start to set up archaeological questions. You start to look for different kinds of networks and concepts and try to lay them out, understand how those are being formed. What kinds of power relationships are here? So to get more to the genealogical question, how might this be being pushed in particular ways today? Yeah.
Sure, I'd say that the idea of social construction itself is extremely powerful, it's pervasive.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very commonly present in our discourse, our media, our schools. I'm a teacher myself.
Mm-hmm.
I know that we're absolutely swimming in it.
Right. So gender itself ends up being an exercise of power. And the examples that you bring up are really interesting. So media, think about media as an apparatus. The idea of social construction, okay, yeah. There's definitely an increased awareness of the idea of social construction itself. And that is incredibly pervasive now in media, education. These are ways in which the terms are being sort of fleshed out. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? Perhaps from someone else, some new?
Our relations within the families, you say parents,
Mm-hmm.
grandparents.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how families are responding to this new challenge. There's, I mean, an intense number of stories about family relationships with within trans communities. It's a place where things are definitely being rethought or reworked out. Yeah. Could you? Mm-hmm. Yeah, culture and religion also really important institutions here that we'd have to pay attention to if we're going to understand what's going on. So you can see how by paying attention to some of the institutions that are morphing or shaping the terms of the debate, you might be able to get a sense of what kinds of possibilities for action there are. There are definitely new kinds of self-creation, new kinds of care of the self that are occurring as a result of the reproblematization of gender. And that could be something that could be traced out in more detail. Obviously, that would take more research than just us sitting around here. But that's sort of the kind of way in which a Foucauldian approach might tackle a question like gender today. There are obviously a multitude of ways, and it's still quite general, but it's meant to give you a sense of what kinds of questions might be generated by a Foucauldian approach. So with that, we've got a few more minutes. I'm happy to just take questions on anything in the presentation. Also, just thanks for coming. If you have any questions later on, feel free to email me. My email's up there. I've been a Foucault nerd for years now, so I'm always happy to answer questions about Foucault. So yeah, just any questions at this point? Yeah.
Many thanks for your presentation. I would like to ask you, according to Foucault, could we draw relationship between terrorism and biopower?
Could we draw a relationship between terrorism?
Side of state and side of terrorism.
Sorry.
Both sides.
Could we draw a relationship between biopower and terrorism? The question will depend on particular questions and contexts. So are there forms of terrorism that are deriving from or responding to forms of biopower? Possibly, but I don't think we could just say that the concept of biopower is in some sense directly related to the concept of terrorism or vice versa. It's going to depend on how those two things are worked out in a particular setting. Presumably, given the kinds of values that biopolitics has, valuing population level health, birth rates, things like that, something like bioterrorism is a particular form of terrorism that would be addressing itself to biopolitics. But it might be a bit too conceptual at this point to give a clear answer.
Actually, I know Foucault teach us that if someone makes some things, need to consider about border of think, about thought, about good life. It's referred to good life. I would like to ask, one terrorist kill himself, execute someone. What referred to this biopower? Could be a relationship between power?
Again, it's going to depend on particular circumstances. It's not a question that can be answered sort of in the abstract, whether or not a particular act of terrorism in any form will be connected to biopower in some sense. That's sort of what I'm trying to get at by saying that biopower is not meant to be a universal concept. It's something that occurs in particular settings at particular times. It spreads in particular ways. It's quite pervasive, but it's never meant to be something that just sort of universally or abstractly can get applied to a situation. Other questions? Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. I was just wondering, do you think that Foucault's theories of power are equally useful when applied to relationships between humans and non-humans, between non-humans and non-humans, or is it pretty bounded within an anthropocentric?
No, I think so. Foucault himself is only interested in people, given the kinds of questions that he's dealing with. But I think you could pretty quickly broaden the scope of his topic into human and non-human relationships. So this question of subjectivity, who is at stake? The who for any one of his topics was just humans, but it wouldn't take all that much to think about human and non-human, human-animal relationships in particular networks where that matters. So if you're talking about, say, a farm, and you want to talk about what kinds of power relationships are occurring at a farm, it'd probably be pretty tough to do that without talking about the influence of animals on the farmer. If a rooster is the thing waking you up, that's an exercise of power. So it definitely could. I don't think it would require very much modification to do so.
Thanks.
Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I just had kind of a methodological question. So, like, once you generate these concepts, where would
Uh, like who to read or something? Because I would say the real way to flesh this stuff out would be talk to people, read the news, pay attention. That's really the place where these things are being worked out. It's not, Foucault had a difficult relationship with philosophy departments. Given that these are such concrete, practical questions, it doesn't make itself very amenable to a sort of general theorizing. So it would really take, I would say, going to a particular circumstance and trying to work out these questions for yourself in practice. Yeah.
Sub-question. So
Sure.
was that reflected in his, I'm totally new to him.
Mm-hmm.
Was that reflected in his methodology? Like how did he get to demography, which seems like such a hard information
Sure.
source?
Well, so
Also, there's a certain amount of credence given to personal conversations.
yeah, well, so the idea is that you look at the kind of general, the problem as it arises, you try to trace out what has built up that problem. And that's where he gets into the more abstract general stuff. A lot of our particular problems are formed in terms of abstract things like demography. So that would then mean going through archives, going through history books. He was an obsessive archivist. Spent hours in the French archives. One of the reasons he moved to Berkeley is because they had a big archive of Greek and Roman work. It's historical labor, more than it is philosophical. I feel like we are running out of time. Yep, thank you all very much for coming.